speaking this morning with Shamim Anwar, who teaches history at Connect College in Lahore and has been teaching more or less for the last 30 years or 30 some years. I know Shamim Anwar for the last few years and in an interesting context, because this was during the Women's Action Forum struggle against Ziaul Haq's Islamization. And in fact, one of the few people that we found who understood what we meant when WAF said that it was not political or whatever, which didn't mean that it was apolitical, but that actually we meant we weren't identified with a particular party. But I remember our discussions on that, and that we felt that the only victory, the only one person who had understood what we were talking about was Shamim Anwar. And talking to us this morning. There are several aspects actually that we wanted to talk about. As you know, we are talking about religion and specifically Islam with a variety of women who perceive it or have different relationships with it. It's really to try and understand the phenomena and I suppose the need for spirituality. In that sense, if you could give us some background in terms of your own personal life, even where you were born and what type of family you came from, your education perhaps, and brothers and sisters, just something that would give us an idea of your background.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I didn't think that I was that important. That was my very first reaction when Salma and my companion came to see me the other day. But anyway, if I can make some contribution towards this project, I think it would be worthwhile. Now, my conviction is that whatever we do in life is a very, very conscious decision. Very conscious decision. Since you've asked me about something about my personal life, my family background, I know it's important. Some of the highlights are always important for any individual. But I still feel that eventually when I say something, I'll say it was my own conscious decision, made by my own free choice, my own experiences. I was born in Jalandhar at my maternal grandparents' home. The most important thing about this factor is that my maternal grandfather was a very great admirer of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, of the Aligarh movement. He was a young student, probably studying in the 9th or 10th class, when Sir Syed came to the Punjab during his fundraising campaigns. And he very proudly used to tell us, when we were little children, that he had collected a sum of money, put it in a bag, and went upstage and handed it over to Sir Syed himself. And Sir Syed sort of patted him on his back and said, if I have students, young people like this, I have nothing to fear. So he was very proud, of this particular incident. And then I remember as I grew up, I visited.
So the family was actually, since you've mentioned Sir Syed, it was obviously a progressive Muslim family.
Because of that is why I'm emphasizing
when you say Jalandhar, are you Punjabi?
Yes, I'm a Punjabi. Yes. From East Punjab.
From East Punjab.
Yeah. So I think this is a very important factor, because I remember the whole atmosphere in this is maternal grandfather, was always very liberal, because of this tremendous impact that he had of Sayyid Ahmad's personality. All his Tehzeeb ul-Akhlaq issues, they were lying at home. Of course, at that time I didn't know its significance, but I felt the impact of it in the sense that my grandfather always insisted on his wife, my grandmother, and his daughters, that they should not wear any burqa. He's saying it is really a crime that women should be covered like this. But they were so afraid of public opinion. Now imagine this is end of 19th century, early 20th century. Like my mother was born in 1903, so you can imagine.
So they took off the burqa at that
They
point?
didn't. He wanted to. But the women folk, his wife and daughters, were a bit afraid of public opinion. Now imagine this, the years. This is early 20th century. So they didn't have the courage to do that, although they had the full backing and incentive that my grandfather was giving. So in that way, very liberal. I learned my first Alim Bebe, through him. He was a very good teacher. I think that was his real vocation, although he didn't become a teacher. But I think if he had more education, he would have preferred that. So he loved teaching his children, then later on his grandchildren.
What did he do?
He was actually in the postal department. He was a postmaster at various places in Punjab and further southeast. Now naturally with this background...
And the women were educated within the home or,
that's a good question. Well, it's like this. As far as the boys are concerned, my eldest uncle went to Aligarh, right from intermediate to MSc in physics. He studied there. My other uncle studied in Lahore, Government College. But although my grandfather would have really very much liked his daughters to go to school, and they did go to school, but they missed on higher education. I mean, up to school life, fine. There was this Madrasatul Banat in Jalandhar. My younger aunts went there. My mother was already married by then before they settled down in Jalandhar. That was a hometown, but he had been transferred to various places. So they went to Madrasatul Banat. My older cousins who were living there, they went to that school. So he did his best. But the problem was that they had to go to hostels, the boys. So the boys were sent to the hostel because he was being transferred. And for two reasons. Partly sending girls to hostels was a very new idea. Secondly, it was too expensive for a large family, all of them to go to the hostels. So these were the two basic problems. But the boys did. So they had higher education. And I think they were some of the very few in those days in our Baradri, as you might call it, in our family. So that was one big factor that affected us. So naturally, my mother came from a very liberal background. My father, my mother, they were both related, but comparatively, my father's background maybe was a slightly more orthodox one, although he also went to Aligarh. He did his FSc from there, but his education was cut short because his father passed away. And then very soon he had to take up a job. Now comes the second very important factor in my life. One was this, the liberal background that my maternal grandparents gave us. I mean, that's my heritage, very important. Because then my mother...
How many brothers and sisters were you?
I'm the eldest of the family, and 3 sisters, 3 brothers. Now, I feel I'm just emphasizing the highlights, which really affected my personality, although the ultimate decision would be mine. Because after all, they were young.
But in terms of religion, was it something
again, the same point, like my Sayyid Ahmad wrote a lot on Islam, and he has created a revolution, even till today. People do not understand Sir Sayyid. He was far ahead of his time. We'll talk more about that later. So my grandfather's concept, let's say, of religion or Islam was very different, very different. Sometimes he would talk in hushed tones and say, I'm saying this to you, but don't pass it on to others because there will be opposition and you'll be in trouble. So a very liberal background indeed. Someone who in 1901 or 2 could tell his wife, don't wear a burqa. I think it's fantastic.
But in terms of your own, as a child, did you go through, the normal things we go through, like reading the Quran and the namaz?
I mentioned that. Oh yes, I mentioned that he taught me the Alif Bay first, and then naturally I started reading the Quran from there. From there I read Urdu naturally. Now that was at a very early stage, but there was a turning point. Very interesting. My father, now this is, I think, a very important factor in my life, as important as my grandfather's own sort of worldview, as you might say. And that is that my father was posted in Bombay. When he took up a job, it was the railways, the Great Indian Peninsular Railway. He was employed there. In fact, most of our menfolk in those days were in the railways, all engineers. Now, he was posted there, and let's say right from my birth. I was born there, but soon after my mother, that was a custom, Then even she went back to Bombay. So right from my birth onwards, till almost partition, except for the last year or so, we were in Bombay.
I see.
Now that had a tremendous impact because Bombay was so different. What it is like today, I cannot say, but at that time, it was so different from the rest of India. There is absolutely no comparison. It was, I can almost say, like a little Europe. When I say Europe, I'm not talking in terms of inferiority complex, but we have to accept that in a certain time and place in world history, or history of humankind, there have been certain areas that have gone ahead while others have been left behind. It was ancient Greece, then ancient Rome, ancient China, India, Iran, and then Arabia, the short history of Arabia too, after the advent of Islam. Then Renaissance in Europe. So the times that we were born, 20th century, we have to accept the fact that even today, Europe leads in concepts and ideas and technology and science, along with, of course, North America now. So we just have to accept these facts as facts of history without any complexes. Because once upon a time, they were in the Dark Ages, and there were others who brought light. But when we were born, it's Europe, so I have no complex about it. So when I say that Bombay was like a little Europe, I'm talking in a very dynamic and positive sense. It had its weak points, but it was so different because I saw the contrast. Bombay and then Jalandhar. Although Punjab has been comparatively a progressive province, and it was the last area to be occupied by the British. While other universities were already established, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Allahabad. Punjab University came in 1882, much later. But Punjabis as such did sort of go forward, go ahead in making up the loss. I think that has been one of their positive points. But still, compared to Bombay, and of course if we go into that, it's a long, long history and we don't have time. It was like a little Europe. Now when I say that, one factor is this, that segregation of the sexes, or that, burqa or chadar, which I saw in, let's say, in UP, which we might visit, or Delhi or Punjab, was absolutely non-existent. There might be some Khojas and Boras, individuals here and there, but by and large, we were so secure, and I could sort of see the boys or men when I was in school. So naturally, very naturally. And my father, who was a little nervous type and slightly more orthodox, had no qualms about this or fears that we walked down to school alone. It was more than a mile away. And we went to St. Joseph's Convent. And he had no fears about it. And we were absolutely secure. Men passed by, nobody stared at us. As a contrast, when we visited Jalandhar, which was at least once, if not twice a year, I could see the difference. The moment we landed at the railway station, we were stared at. We sat in a tonga coming home, we were even followed. Some people even came and stared into our faces as if we were some species from another planet. And I said to my mother, why do you have to come to Jalandhar? I don't like it. I just don't like this kind of behavior. Why are the men staring? And Mummy was in a burqa when she entered, you see. And
but you weren't?
Not at that stage. We were still very young. As long as we were in Bombay, there was no burqa. So that is important. You see, when I say little Europe, I mean this. That we were absolutely unconscious. This was St. Joseph's Convent.
You went to a missionary
school, St. Joseph's Convent.
So
in Bandra. If I'm not wrong, even Miss Tina went to that school.
But were you given sort of education in scripture, etc. at that point?
Well, it was just at home. You mean in the convent?
In the convent.
Oh, yes. It was compulsory.
So you also had
Yes,
that.
I read the Bible. We had this, it was compulsory. We had an exam on it. But at the same time, my parents insisted that I must read the Quran at home as well.
I had both.
I had both. And then, of course, I insisted that I don't understand the language. They said, all right, read in translation. Now, I think it must have been a very subtle influence, which is going to burst out later on, that I didn't get much from the translation either. I mean, Arabic, fine, I didn't know, but Urdu I could understand a bit. But apart from that Urdu education that I had from my grandfather, I had no formal education after that. That was all till the age of 6 or 7. Because in Bombay, no Urdu was taught. French was taught, of course English was there, so I had no formal education in Urdu. That's my drawback, no doubt. But I had to read, and then I used to question my mother that I don't understand this sentence or that sentence. But I just had to dutifully read it, like any Muslim home. But the general atmosphere in the home was very liberal. That's important. I mean, that was a ritual, I performed it. As I grew up, I had to pray, or you must pray, try to fast if you can. These rituals were observed. I suppose it also becomes a matter of identity. I don't know. I mean, you have to have a lot of strength to break that identity. But nevertheless, I followed what they said. I mean, I knew that I'm born in a Muslim family, so I obeyed. I mean, I did not say no as such. I was still very small. But in school, again, we had to study the Bible, and I studied that as well. I had some knowledge of that too. Now the point is that partly the Bombay atmosphere, partly the school I went to, it was so different from my experience in Jalandhar. And I wasn't very happy when my mother announced that we are going to Jalandhar. Because of that, that idea that men stare at you, they misbehave. I think that stuck in my mind, although I had a much more pleasant experience in Bombay. The contrast was there. So you see, when you see two things, I think it's important. The contrast. You see, if I had only lived in Jalandhar, I might have been perhaps a different person, I don't know. But living mainly in Bombay and visiting Jalandhar for short periods, I knew that there were two ways of life. And I preferred the Bombay way of life, where I was free, where nobody stared at me. I mean, I was just myself. I mean, this was important, I think. Living in Bombay has had
What are you talking about now when you moved back to Jalandhar?
No, we didn't move back, we used to visit.
When you visited?
Oh, we never lived there. Never. I mean, I was born there, and then there were these annual visits.
So all your schooling,
was
etc.
all in Bombay.
College as well?
No, college I came to Canada.
I see.
But school life, you see, but there is very interesting interlude also. I hope you get that point. I mean, because many people have said to me that there's something different. When you say Punjabi, fine, but there's something different. I don't understand what they mean. But then when they discover that I lived for at least 16 years in Bombay, they said, well, that's it. So Bombay is a very important factor in my life, as a second factor. First, my grandfather and the Aligarh movement that he was involved in, and secondly, Bombay. The third factor comes in when my father, on his own request, he wasn't well, and he was transferred from Bombay to Jhansi, which is a coastal area.
Yeah.
For years and years he had been living there, and that was a very dry climate. They made a choice for him in Jhansi. The moment we landed there, he said, well, why not go to Aligarh? It's close by and you have no idea of Urdu. You have been living in an atmosphere which is very different from, let's say, Jalandhar, or that you should know something about yourself. And Aligarh, well, nothing like it. So I said, fine. So he got the prospectus where it said, now this is something interesting, that the uniform that they will, there's no uniform in the school, but when they move out, the uniform is a black burqa.
Achha, for men it was the achkan and whatever. For women it was the burqa.
Black burqa when you move out. But inside there was no uniform. No, you could wear any dress, no uniform in school or college. But when you move out, and we did move out, like students went to the boys' university college to listen to politicians maybe later on, or maybe go even attend some classes, college students, if some laboratories were not available, and so on. So when they moved out, or even went out for a walk, then they had to wear a black burqa. Now that was a uniform. Now you can imagine why. Because one had to be very cautious. Like women, this college was established the same year as Canada, 1913. Now when you start on such a venture, when people were totally against it, and many Muslim leaders were against it, so one had to be very cautious. I mean, we have to see it in the historical context. I'm sure later on if it had been established later, or if you go and see it now, I'm sure it is irrelevant, the burqa that way. But I think it is an interesting factor in my life. Because when he said that, my father said, well, now you have to have a burqa made. And I was a teenager. I was in class 9th. That means in class 8 or 6th standard, I studied in Bombay. Right from KG onwards, up to 6th standard, which is class 8. So class 9th, I came to Aligarh. Now, wearing a burqa. Now, I couldn't walk. I fell down several times. It was awful. But somehow that obedience, I never questioned till that time what my father wanted me to do, what the Aligarh University wanted us to do. I didn't question. Now this is 45 to 47,
So the
you might
movement
say.
is very much at its
Yes,
height.
exactly.
Okay.
I was coming to that, exactly. 45 to 47. So that is when we matriculated, my sister and I, almost together. Now when we went there, in a burqa, of course some of the teachers, when they saw us, they said, we can see what your background is. If only your father had written to us, we would have said no burqa for these girls, as if no rigidity about it. So, but then my father said, now that you're wearing it, he believed in it, then wear it, you see. So for 2 years we were there in the hostel. And as you just now mentioned, the political movement was at its height. I remember one disappointment because Quaid-e-Azam was supposed to come and address in the famous Reggie Hall in Aligarh University. But then we were told that he's not well. He never kept well. He was living through sheer willpower at that stage. And it was announced he cannot come, but Liaquat Ali will come instead. Now, although we were in the 9th or 10th at that time, we insisted. No, I mean, while I was in Bombay, I was not very much politically aware. But the moment I entered the Aligarh atmosphere, it had changed. It was electrifying. I don't know how it happened. So when they said the college students are going to listen to Liaquat Ali, I said, why not us? We are in the 10th class, 9th class, why not us? He said, oh no, you are school children. I said, no, but you must give us some background, some training before we are eligible. I mean, we argued that way. We must read newspapers and we must sit in the newspaper room that we had in the college and I must go and listen to it. So the wardens and the teachers were very understanding. They said, okay, if you really are interested, why not? So I remember listening to Liaquat Ali and I remember the sentence, the next day it was in the headline in the newspaper, that Aligarh University is the arsenal of Pakistan. I still remember that. I remember him saying that. And we had a special women's gathering from where we listened. So it is true that I became aware of the movement in its own way. And the names of these leaders, which were very vague before this, somehow. Of course, my father was also politically aware in the sense, although he said he was an engineer, in the sense that he would listen to every speech because Bombay was a center of activity.
They were pro the movement. Right?
Oh yes, very pro.
Very pro.
Yes, very pro Pakistan, my father.
Why? Because they didn't feel that they could, that the Muslims actually needed a homeland, or they could stay on with
I think, I was very, and if I see it in that context, I was very young to understand his motives. But I overheard some conversation, and I think my father must have felt like whenever there was a question of promotion. Now, I mean, that's the thing about my experience because I didn't know much. The Hindu officers or his bosses would always put an obstacle in his way. Just because he was a Muslim. So they also opened a Muslim association of railway workers, and he was a secretary or something, and he would go and fight for his rights. And he would go and meet every political leader that was possible. He was interested, very much politically aware. And then what the British would do is, they believed in the rule of law and merit, the right man in the right place. Now, he was a very bright person in his own area. So what the British used to do was that let's have an exam, a test. Whoever tops will be promoted. And I remember 2 such occasions when my father prepared for an exam and topped the exam and was promoted. Now that's the only experience I know that maybe that was something so personal and he felt that he would have no good deal if there was a united India.
So he opted for that.
So eventually, oh yes, he did. So he was politically aware, and I think eventually that must have affected me unconsciously. But the conscious thing that I saw was in Aligarh. So there it was, there was a 46 election, 45, 46 general elections were held after the Second World War. And again the college students went out canvassing for votes, and again I said the same thing. We want to accompany them. They said, no, you're a schoolgirl. They said, no, prepare us. We know we won't be able to talk, but we want to see what the senior girls are saying. So I remember we went in Tongas from home to home. I didn't say anything, I just listened. And I remember some criticism. Oh, but Jinnah doesn't have a beard. And the girls, of course, had answers to that. And that stuck in my mind as odd. See, I was still naturally a schoolgirl, 9th, 10th. So I said, what an objection. I mean, I couldn't maybe argue myself, but I said, what an objection. That he doesn't have a beard. So that stuck in my mind also, that this is so naive. So far, these were my experiences. But then I think the turning point came. I think it all sort of brews in your mind, all the things that I was absorbing. Now, since we are talking about women also, I might say a few words about my experiences in Jalandhar. Just one or two. We lived in an area where, there was some, as you say, the house of a bow, as used to call it, say middle class families. And then around further on, there were others like weavers and carpenters and farmers, living there. And there was total equality in the sense my grandparents welcomed them and we went to their homes. There I saw how some of these women were treated. Things that happened on very silly issues, like a woman could be divorced, or what you call atta-batta, those marriages. One couple is very happy, the other is not. When one is being divorced, the other also has to leave, and that was the most painful thing I've ever seen in my life. Like this woman, she didn't want to be divorced. And she just beat herself like mad, and all her hair was all on the floor, I saw it. She just pulled out. And she was a very nice person, very pretty. And she used to come to our place, and I said, what? I just thought, why is this happening? I just absorbed it. I wouldn't say anything. I must be about 7 or 8 or 10 years old. And then I remember later on, she being married to somebody else, and I could hear her cries as if she is being burnt alive or buried alive or something like that. I think these things just sunk in. It must have affected me somehow. Because the atmosphere at home, my home or grandparents' home, that was harmonious. The men were very respectful of women. I didn't notice anything special. But these experiences around that I saw in Jalandhar, not in Bombay, that even till today, I cannot forget. It's awful. So that was it when partition takes place. Now,
so after partition, you moved to Lahore?
To Lahore. See, my father opted, and he came to NW Railways, as it was known as. And we were told to reach Lahore, or wherever you were posted, by the 14th of August. You see, midnight, 14th, they were going to announce. So by 14th, sometime you should arrive. And I remember, my goodness, my parents talking that I'll go and reserve the seats. At that time, we had gone back to Bombay, and then we were, just on a visit, and we were coming from there to Lahore. It was a long journey, 2 nights and 2 days. So he said, I'll reserve the seats for the 12th, he said, and on the 14th we'll be there. Long journey, But he said, supposing, because there's so much of pressure, a rush, and if we can't, then naturally it will be 13th, my mother. I remember my mother saying, naturally then it will be the 13th, we can't help it. And do you know, we were lucky, otherwise I wouldn't have been alive today. On the 12th, the seats were reserved. We reached here sometime on the 14th. And one train followed us, and the next train that came was totally butchered. Midnight, as they say, the signal was given. That is how it all started. And my mother, as we traveled, she said, I noticed there's a lot of tension because we passed right through East Punjab to come to Lahore. You see, in the headquarters of NWR. And we didn't stop at Jalandhar, we came straight here, and the boundary line had not yet been announced. So my mother said, I've passed this way so many times, but it's very tense. There's something wrong somewhere. She felt it. When we reached Lahore, and that midnight it was announced that, this is the boundary line, and we've lost East Punjab and our hometown Jalandhar. And the second or the first train that followed us had been butchered. Women abducted, men massacred. And then the train was sent to Lahore in that condition. That is where the reaction started in Lahore. Otherwise, till then, many Hindus were living this whole Shahalmi market. It was Hindu and they were still living there. But then they said, if this is what it's going to be like, oh my God, then the massacre started in Lahore. And I saw it all. Now, I'm mentioning this as something very significant because it affected me a lot. That's a turning point. When I started reading about whether it was within Pakistan here or outside, that the women were being abducted, women were being raped, it may have started there, but then the reaction started here. My first question to my father was, you put a burqa on us, I still remember. But life is not that simple. This is history in the making. You knew what the freedom movement was all about, much, much more than I know. I mean, I hardly knew anything, really. You should have given us guns instead of a burqa. That was my first question. And my father was so shocked because that was the first challenge I had ever thrown. I was the eldest and his favorite. And very dutiful, interested in studies, topping the classes, in school and so on. Now, of course, I had matriculated and so on.
But did you feel so antagonistic to the Hindus that you felt the gun was necessary?
No,
or no,
I was talking about the rape.
Yeah.
The rape of women. I mean, either way. You see, the headline said, so many raped in East Punjab, so many raped in, or abducted in Lahore, Pindi. It was not, at that moment, see, it was a women's issue for me. From that is where it started. I knew nothing about the freedom movement, frankly speaking. I mean, we had just finished schooling, but we didn't know much. We knew that we want Pakistan, and we used to go ahead and have processions inside the college. We will have Pakistan. But in school, I mean, that is what we all wanted, and I sort of never questioned. I had never questioned anybody or challenged anybody till then. Afterwards, I read an article in psychology that by the time you are 17, 18, round about that time, by that time you should have challenged something. If you don't, perhaps you never will. Maybe you will, but most probably not. And that was just my age. And that was my first question. It was not a question of the Hindu. I said, look, women are being abducted everywhere. Whether it's Lahore, Pindi, or East Punjab, or Delhi, Lucknow, or Calcutta, whatever. The point is the woman. So you see, since we are talking about women, that my first question in life, challenging our way of life or whatever was happening around me, was the woman. And it was this, that you put a burqa on us, you donned a burqa on us. You should have given us really a gun to defend ourselves against abduction and rape. I mean, that was my way of putting it.
Yeah.
So then he kept quiet. I mean, he was taken aback that this daughter of mine has never given me any trouble or put any questions. I said, pray, she prays. I said, in the Quran she prays, she does. I said, don't meet and talk to so and so, she doesn't. And suddenly she stands up and challenges me. And my next question was the next day, I'm not going to wear a burqa. I just won't wear a burqa. Because I do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. This is history. Today this has happened. And the very fact that we are alive today is just luck. Because if you had no seats on the 12th, you would have reserved it on the 13th. I don't know where we all women would have been today. Your wife, your daughters. That was my question. So I said, I'm not going to wear a burqa. But I said, no, comparatively, he was more orthodox compared to my mother or my grandfather. He said, you are going to wear it. In the meantime, Kanair opened and I joined Kanair. That I must pay tribute to my parents on this, that both my parents, they were very, very highly motivated as far as education is concerned. Both of them had been frustrated in the sense that their education had been cut short. And as if they were, you might put it that way, living in their children that they must get higher education. So that also helped us. I remember that my father's main concern used to be, which is the best school? which is the best college. And he saw to it that we got the best. When if he lived in Bandra in Bombay, it was because Bandra was best as far as schools are concerned. So he settled down there, and that is where we lived and we studied. So I think that's a very important factor. We were highly motivated. And there was always a book in our hands. Eventually, I remember my mother saying, "Oof, I've reached a point that I want to burn your books now." So I said, "Well, you encouraged us." And now when I see, young people, they have no reading habits at all. So I feel thankful to my parents. They used to read. There were books at home. They motivated us. So I think that is significant. And of course, education was more important at that time than any other issue. Like today, marriage becomes more important. Or some other issue becomes more important. Some events become more important. Oh, you can miss your class because we have to go to a party. Never. Never. So we were, in fact, ourselves so highly motivated that even when we were ill, we wouldn't tell our parents because we didn't want to miss the school. I mean, to that extent. So that, I think, is an important factor. Now, the question that I had put to my father had shocked him partly, but he wouldn't give in the beginning. He said, "No, you have to wear a burqa." Now the funny thing was, many people remember this in Lahore, my contemporaries and seniors, that we were staying 4 miles away from college. There was no other way but to cycle to college. And this was along the canal bank, right from Mughalpura up to Jail Road Canal Bridge. So my father said, "Fine, learn cycling." I said, "Yes, but what about the burqa?" He said, "You cycle in a burqa." Just like that. Now, I think that sense of honesty also, I said, "Okay, we can't give up education. But all right, if you want us to do that, we do it." And I continued my fight against the burqa, but I wore the burqa, so did my sister, and we cycled to college. Of course, fellow students laughed, but very good-humoredly. People were surprised, but we were like, real heroines. So we have to do this, we have to build up Pakistan. Now that kind of motivation was there. We have to study. There's no other way out. But my struggle went on. But it's a fact that we would never remove the burqa. Once we were out, we cycled in it, we went right into the college. There we removed it. We used to wear it again right in the veranda, the corridors of the college, and cycle back. Very honest about it. So this happened for more than a year. But after that, our struggle went on. And in the meantime, in Pakistan Times, there was a whole controversy, the letters column on burqa. It had started. And I joined that debate. So now that was different because when I talked to my father, we became both emotional at times. Now this was interesting for 2 reasons. One, he read the code print and the code logic that I had put in. Secondly, a certain sense of pride. Now my daughter can write and it's printed, So he started reading it. I think all that had an impact because I stopped arguing too much after that. I said, "I'll write." And when 1 year was over, he said, "Okay. I may not totally approve, but you can give it." Now, when I look back, my hindsight, I don't regret it. Because now we wore it 2 years in Aligarh. But that wasn't much because we were in the hostel, so we hardly. But 1 year here in Lahore, I know through personal experience what a horror it is. And what change came for the worse in the sense that I was a bold girl when I was in Bombay. We walked, we could talk to anybody. Now I became a nervous wreck. And a strange fear of men developed, which wasn't there before. Now that experience is there, that lack of understanding on what are men like and so on and so forth. And I used to argue these things when I wrote to the editor, So I'm glad. I don't regret. Of course, at that time I was very angry. But now, hindsight tells me that no, there is no substitute experience. And I'm glad I wore it because I was able to argue against it from so much conviction and experience, and I fought back. And the moment we gave up burqa, it had a tremendous impact on many of my cousins, like the junior to us. They came to college, they also started giving up burqa. So I do not know about the society as a whole, but in our own family, first cousin, second cousin, it's a very big family. Slowly they were giving up, and I was so happy. First they would criticize us, but slowly they realized nothing wrong in it. The way they are studying and they've gone to a university, they're doing the MA, why not our daughters? First they criticized, but then they did exactly what we were doing. So I was very happy. I didn't mind the criticism as long as I had achieved this something as a model that my cousins are doing the same thing. Now that was it. But it did not end there. This was burqa. Suddenly the question came up. I don't enjoy praying. I've been only praying because you told me to pray. I obeyed you. I was told to obey my parents and I obeyed you, but I have never enjoyed it. Please tell me, why should I pray? Now, my parents do not have a very convincing answer. That's a fact. So slowly I started giving up. I would pray once or twice. Gradually I gave up even that. Then same thing with fasting. Of course, my physical constitution was such I could never fast. But in theory, everybody else was of course fasting at home. I said, why do you fast? No, again, no answer. Just if they said, this is what Islam expects you to do, I wasn't convinced. I said, why? Now it was why and why all the time. So I said, I told my father that you were an ardent Pakistani. You were in the Pakistan movement. What were you fighting for? To pray, to fast. You were doing that even before partition. I want conviction. So that is how I turned gradually towards total, you might call it agnosticism, doubt, atheism, whatever. I don't know what it was.
When you're talking about the rituals, it was also the faith that was moving you?
Well, you see, the point is that these were the main things that we are told to do. Now, what is faith?
Yeah.
We hardly knew anything about it. So this is what religion has come down to. And then, of course, I realized that not only the burqa, the status of a woman in the name of Islam was not something that I could appreciate. So gradually things started moving on. From burqa to other things. It could be the way people got married, the divorce issue. So many things concerning women came up gradually. Burqa was the first issue, but so many other things about women. And nobody was able to give me a convincing answer.
Did you perceive this from society or by reading the Quran or reading religious texts or interpretation?
Of course, what was happening around me was very important. That was one thing.
So how
it was important. Practiced.
Articulated.
And yes, that also bothered me a lot. And secondly, the translations that I read in Urdu or English didn't satisfy me. Not at all. And a point came when I think I had totally and very honestly, there were no doubts about it. I rejected it. But
you use the word agnostic. Not an atheist.
Agnostic, sometimes I felt agnostic. I think that was the early phase, and then I atheist. In fact, if anybody talked about God and then later on mentioned Muhammad or any other Nabi, I said, at first I used to sort of get very, very irritated. Then I said, okay, you talk, I'm going away. I would just leave the room eventually. I didn't even want to discuss the issue anymore. I was really disgusted in the true sense of the word. And I think that lasted right from partition, the questions began. And it lasted for almost, I would say, nearly 9-10 years.
Meanwhile, you had finished college and were teaching.
Now, by that time, yes, I did my BA, then I went to my master's. And then I was now teaching.
You were now
I just started teaching.
So what happened at the end of the 9 or 10 years? Which is
now I'm going to mention a name which is a taboo in our society.
I know which name you're going to mention.
And it was just through sheer accident. Because I think I would have been a confused person. Because in the meantime, there were other avenues I was trying to find.
Can I ask you a personal question? From this family that you come from, you didn't get married. There was no pressure on you to decide.
Now that is interesting. Like my other sisters are married. I decided. You see, the thing is, now I do not know what are the influences. I know I was extremely sensitive. I do feel that. Maybe I didn't realize it, but my younger sisters and brothers did mention this later, that you were a very sensitive person. Now, some of those experiences I've mentioned in Jalandhar, maybe that. Partly I remember the typical attitude towards, Saas-Bahu relationship. My mother was very unhappy with her mother. That is true, but he knows about him. And he has one or two other books by him. So I was quite surprised. I said, he has something to say. But of course, it was just a little point that went in, the seed, but still I wasn't happy yet. Now, so then as time passed, maybe some issue arose in my mind about something. So I said, now who will answer? My father doesn't have any convincing answers. I mean, he is not a scholar that way. So what shall I do? Then I wrote a letter because the address was there, and I wrote a letter to him. I forget exactly what the issues were, and I said, well, this is it. So he immediately answered. It was one question, he answered it briefly, and it seemed sort of reasonable to me. It was a small, simple question. Then I said, why not ask him sort of bigger questions, bigger issues came up. And I put 3 or 4 questions. Immediately the answer came again. And he did it so well. It may be just one sentence. It may be even one word, or it may be just a small paragraph. I said, how well he does it. I mean, he must be so well read himself and so scholarly that he's able to do such a thing. That without much explanation, he just manages to satisfy me. And so, correspondence started. On and on and on it went. The whole of 50, the rest of 56, 57. And then it came to such a pass that he felt that this was just too much. I mean, too much work for him. He was such a busy man. So an uncle of mine, whom he knew, he was my mother's cousin, and he had been with him for years, pre-partition days. He wrote, somehow he came to know, he found out, who I was, and he came to know that I was a niece of this, the gentleman. So he wrote to him that, why don't you help? Because I'm ready to help too, but this is too much. I mean, she's just going crazy with questions and I have to answer. So he came and saw me, very happy that, one day I hope that you would come down. I said, I always wanted to, but you never used to listen. I said, I didn't even know what you were talking about. I was so fed up of the whole society and what was Islam, has given to us, that I didn't even want to listen to anybody. Almost fanatically, I had rejected it. I mean, I don't blame myself for anybody else who would reject the way things are. Anyway, so he said, look, why don't you read books? I said, yes, I'd like to buy. So I said, well, I have money for so many books. And he said, no, I'll get you the whole set. And you can pay me in installments. I said, fine. And I remember that summer and the following summer, when I had time, I just sat in my room reading and reading, asking my uncle some questions, writing to him as well.
All the books by the way?
He gave me a whole set because I wanted to know what he was saying. Then by 58, we were told that he has sought an early retirement on health basis and he wants to shift to Lahore because Karachi doesn't suit him. And imagine when he settles down just near our house. I mean, his house number is 25 and ours is 26. Imagine. And then, of course, in between I met him once because there was a convention.
Do you think God had a hand in that?
I don't know. I don't take it that way. I don't take
I'm just teasing you.
So, he sort of came once to Lahore. They used to have annual conventions in Karachi or some other city. So, one year they had it in Lahore. So, I went there just to see him, as I want to sort of meet him. And then for the first time after almost 2 years correspondence, we met. And in the meantime, he was planning to come back to Lahore. And I kept on insisting, you must come to Lahore. There's so much to ask. Letters are not enough. So once he moved in here, then, every evening he was available after 4 p.m. Anyone could come and question him, anybody. And there it was, day after day, questions and questions and questions. I think it must have taken me at least 3 years of reading and discussions before I thought that, I could accept and I could identify myself, with this movement or with his ideas, whatever he's saying.
What exactly was he saying? I know a little, I read very little about Parvez. I in fact know more about him, and we went to see him a few times, particularly when Zia came into power.
Yes.
We went often to talk to him about how to counter.
I remember the first time I went with him.
And then we went a few times after that. So I met him a few times in this context too. But how did you perceive it to be different from the normal interpretation?
Very different. I think there is no connection.
Yes, but how? What would you say?
Actually the first thing, I cannot now say it chronologically, but what I can remember, that I had sort of, pulled myself away from religion as such, whether it was Islam or Christianity or Hinduism. I felt we were all the same. None of them appealed to me, frankly speaking. It was not only Islam. And when he emphasized that religion is actually a very perverted and a very distorted form of what the first Nabi may have said, that this is very perverted and there is no such word as mazhab which we use that occurs in the Quran. It's not mazhab at all. Now somehow that kind of an argument, appealed to me at once. I cannot say whether that was the very first thing, but I can feel that this must have affected me a great deal, because I would not listen to about religion from anybody. He said, it is not a religion. Then I said, what is it? He said, it is something like what you have now in Pakistan or any other country. You have a government, you have a constitution, there are certain laws that have to be obeyed. The difference lies in this, that either the laws are purely man-made, let's say made by a monarch or a dictator or by a majority vote. The system may differ, but it's man-made.
Yes.
And when we talk about Islam as not a religion as such, but as a deen, then deen means that it's not a man-made law entirely, but it's a law which is based on a divinely revealed guideline. So actually you are really implementing a certain system. It may be political, economic, social. It's the wholeness of a person that it deals with, that wholeness of it. Now that appealed to me very much, again, the totality of man, the wholeness of man. Because I did have a feeling that we were split. Like people said, well, this is public law, this is personal law. This is according to man-made laws, and this is according to divine laws. That splitting of life didn't appeal to me. I think that was one of the things I rejected. Splitting. So here he talked about the wholeness of man, that it sort of encompasses, the whole life, the whole of you, the totality of you. And it is done through a system, just like any other system, only that's man-made, and this has some divine guidelines. So he talked it that way, So it sort of appealed to me.
Divine guidelines for him came from Islam itself.
Naturally he was talking about Quran. Now here there are two important points which further came up. One of them was, which I think again that appealed to me. History had done one thing to me. It was a whole process of evolution, no doubt. But even when something wonderful happened, a very great revolution took place, then it was followed by some very ugly happenings too. And somehow as if you felt that something has been achieved, but a lot has been lost as well. A revolution or a change could bring in so much of torture and pain. So I said, why should it be this? Because I was very much affected by the Reformation in Europe. Martin Luther, rejecting the church organization, separating from it eventually, and saying that, reason is very important. Then reason became, like in the French Revolution, the age of reason, 18th century, 17th century, it was always reason. So we had discussed these things in European history. So I said, if reason is so important, the French revolutionaries actually worshipped the goddess of reason. But then why do we blunder so much? Why so much torture, pain? So much happens which should not happen if we have reason, good reason. Now that used to bug me somewhat. Now I'm articulating it. It's possible at that time I wasn't so articulate about it. But that feeling was there. Why? Because French Revolution was followed by so much horror. And yet I was an admirer of the revolution. I said, but I can't understand. So, there was some sort of a block. I couldn't go any further. Then the Russian Revolution. Then the things I read about Stalin. I couldn't bear that. So this, I think, the ground was prepared sort of. When he said to me, I said, why is this divine law necessary? The arguments went on back and forth. It took 3 years, long years. It wasn't easy to bring me round. If any stage I had been dissatisfied, I would have maybe just moved away. So I said, divine law, what? How are we even convinced? Allah and then Nabi and divine law. So he says, well, the point is that man has reason, which is very important, but it is not pure reason. Now suddenly, that clicked. For instance, reason is not rejected as many religious people would do, or many mystics would do. It is very important. Without that, you cannot understand the divine law. So then he compared that with our own physical eyes. For instance, when now the light is on, or there is sunshine, and we can see. But what happens when there is darkness? We can't see anything. Our eyes are the same, they are healthy, normal. Why can't we see it? So the scientific explanation is, according to him, that something in our eye, the retina or whatever, must come in contact with something outside the eye. It may be the rays of the sun, or it may be a bulb. And when it comes in contact, your eye can see. When that is gone, then you grope in the dark. But if the light is there and you close your eye, you can't see it either. I close my eyes, I can't see the light. I can't see you. So what you have to do is open your eyes, and it should come, reason. Keep your reason functioning fully and bring it in touch with the Quran, which is the source of divine law. And when it comes in touch, meaning otherwise that reason, when it tries to understand the law, then there is light. Then the reason understands. But if you close your reason, the laws won't be understood. You try to understand with reason, then it becomes possible to implement.
Present position, you do believe in this divine...
It's reason plus the divine law.
Divine law. But you, as a Muslim, feel that it is articulated in the Quran. How do you look at the Quran itself? Because there's a lot in the Quran which is quite abhorrent, to say the least. How do you relate to that?
Now, you see, that is where a lot of things come in, what you call the way, as I said when I was reading the translations in Urdu or English, it didn't sort of quite appeal to me in many places. Now, as I pursued the discussions with him and plus reading his books, I discovered how wrongly those words were understood. The words or the science of words, semantics, is something I learned from him. It's a very great science in the West. They do so much research. Words are very important. Now, even when I use the word, let's say for deen they said mazhab, or made deen into a mazhab, the whole thing changed. Now, when we use the word salat or ibadat, now we just take it as worship, namaz, prastish, which doesn't appeal to me even today.
But
it just doesn't.
But
it
there's
just
not
doesn't.
very categorical things. Say on the whole issue, there are many things in the
We'll be
Quran.
coming. I'll explain. This will be a long discussion.
Not
but
only
we'll
women,
go
but
through
say
it.
slavery.
Another thing, I'm coming to that. Yes, I'm coming to that. That is why I got his book also, where you can photostat some of those passages which I would like. I mean, 1 or 2 pages. Now, that exactly is the point. See how it has been projected. One thing you understood now, that it is reason plus divine law, which appealed to me because that is what was bugging me, maybe in an unconscious way. Secondly, he said that every nook and corner has received the message of this planet, but it doesn't exist in its authentic form. See, so all of them had the divine origin, but the only authentic book available is this book. Now that was one thing. Secondly, he explained that if you do not follow this book, you reject it. Fine, you have every free will to reject it. I mean, that is your human right to reject it. Then you come under what is known as the cosmic law of trial and error. And the challenge of the Quran is that if you do not accept it now, which is your right, your free will, then through trial and error, slowly and gradually, but probably with more pain and a longer period of time, you will be moving towards the same direction. Now that was another thing he explained. Now that was one point. Secondly, or thirdly rather, he said that you have to be very sure about the sources of the Quran. Source of Islam. You have to identify. Now we often get this question in Islam, what are the sources of Islam? They start saying hadith and fiqh and Quran and ijma and this and that, different. Now Quran is, according to what he explained, that the only divine source, the emphasis on divine, is the Quran. He emphasized.
But that's a contradiction. If it is so divine, why does it say so much that is
now
so uncomfortable?
Now we are coming to that point. Now what happens is that so much literature has come down to us. It may be history, it may be biographies, it may be fiqh, it may be hadith, whatever. What we do is we read that, those who try to interpret or try to translate, they take those meanings from fiqh and hadith and translate the Quran according to what they have got there, what they have read in hadith or fiqh. They translate it accordingly, irrespective of what the Quranic text or the Arabic language is saying. Now
but
his challenge
work
was
that has been done on the Arabic itself by, say, a lot of feminist scholars, Fatma Mandisi, etc., who have worked on the original Arabic text. Those texts and those ayats that we're talking about are very much there.
Now I come to that point. The point is, now you get that as a source. Now what happens is that the Quran has a methodology. Now, is it going to be a violent revolution, a sudden change? This is the most significant point. And for me personally, that's the only way that I was convinced. Because naturally when I was discussing, same questions arose which you were asking. And this was what finally I think which clinched the matter. The Quran gives basically the ultimate goals where human destiny should be leading to. They are known as permanent values, human permanent values. And I have a whole list of those in this book, which you might just read if you...
But those are very similar to other religions. All religions have a basic morality.
One is this morality. But there are certain things which deal with something more than that. For instance, it says in categorical terms, no mincing of words, that the whole human family is composed of human family, or rather, let me put it this way, the whole human race, insan, forms one human family. That is your ultimate goal, how to establish a human family. You are today divided into, let's say, lingual, regional,
well, in those days,
units, tribal units. Today there are more than 160 members of the UNO. You are split into units. Eventually, you should be moving towards one human family with the whole planet Earth as your homeland. You make this land or that land as your homeland. The planet is your homeland as a human family. Now that is eventually the goal you must be moving towards. Then it says, every human being, by virtue of being the child of a human being, is honorable, respectable. Respect him. It can command respect. If you don't give, it can stand up and say, I must be respected. Irrespective
all
of
slaves and women.
No. नहीं, उसमें ये नहीं दिया.
It does. Slavery.
No, I'm coming to that. Irrespective of any consideration, you command respect because all that matters is you're a human being. Bas. Then it also goes on to say that all human beings are equal. ये जुमली है ये सब.
It says this, but
I'm coming to that. पहले ये goal जो है ना, this should be clear. That's the ultimate goal. अब ये overnight तो नहीं हो सकता ना. Then ये तो हो गया ना, sort of at the social level you might say. Political level पर उन्होंने खास ये जुमले दिए कि you must always decide your issues through arguments, discussion. You should never be authoritarian. Then your people who are administering you should be chosen on merit. चाहे वो head of the state हो कैसे भी हो. Merit is the issue, not birth or any other consideration. Birth को तो totally reject कर दिया. Totally, birth is rejected. Your caste, your class, your color, your language is based on birth. खत्म करो इस चीज़ को. You are all equal, irrespective of any consideration. अब politically ये हो गया consultation से ये सारा कुछ होना चाहिए. Then economically ये है. I'm only giving you guidelines, but details बाद में आती हैं कि every living being, leave alone human being, every living being must have its basic needs fulfilled as a matter of right. Not just कि somebody is given charity or philanthropy or रहम आ गया. No, as a matter of right, the basic, to begin with, the very basic needs should be fulfilled. Now, these are the goals. Some of the goals that you have to move towards.
Which are similar to other religions.
हाँ, लेकिन उसमें ये है ना कि ये जो है ना economic system, general बातें तो आ जाएंगी, वो भी trial and देखो ना when I say religion, when you say religion, तो ये तो कोई बात आ गई ना जैसे प्रोफेसर साहब कहते थे कि ये सारा सबका origin तो वही है. The same revelation है ना? नहीं वो revelation है ना एक ही है. अब in spite of some distortion or loss or change, at times you can discover some very beautiful sentences here and there, whether it is the Bible or Talmud or Avesta or whatever. You will find it. Maybe not in totality, it has changed. But here and there, some beautiful sentences will prove to you that the source was divine. ये वो कहते हैं.
That is your
that is why. No, that is why.
Now I'm trying actually what to get at the contradiction.
Yes, I'm coming to that. ये तो आप ये बात आप समझ गए ना.
I understand what the Quran is saying in spirit.
No, but you said that this is the
Quran
same with other religions. वो ये है not in totality, and it should be something should tally because source तो थी ना तो कुछ तो बाकी रह जाना चाहिए ना. Even if it is lost, something remains.
But there is a.
Now
like the Quran can say 100 times that there should be equality. But when the Quran also says that there can be slaves, it is not.
No. It doesn't say. I'm coming to that point.
Slaves it definitely says.
No, I'm coming to that point. अब ये कह देना ना कि अच्छा कुरान का ये भी बड़ा सख्त क्लेम है कि अगर ये ह्यूमन सोर्स होता है ना इस किताब का, it will be full of contradictions.
It is.
हाँ वो ये कहता अगर ये ह्यूमन सोर्स होती तो. अच्छा अब पॉइंट ये है कि वो हो गया ना गोल सामने. अच्छा अब आ गई क्वेश्चन ऑफ मेथडोलॉजी का ये है कि कैन यू ब्रिंग अ सडन चेंज. ये गोल तो whenever I talk about these permanent values to anybody, people say, oh my God, but this is too idealistic. This is impossible to achieve. So I said, well, your life should be inspired by some idealism. You will never be perfect, but you have to move towards it. And immediately reaction ये होता है, this is too idealistic. कुरान भी ये कहता है कि you can't make a jump from here to that point overnight, and it is not good if you try to do that. Then I realized this is what happened with the French and the Russian revolutions. Okay, they tried to make a jump, and what it ended into: terrible dictatorships, revival of empires, and then again dictatorship. It took 100 years for France to settle down, and so much torture, so much suffering. And look at the period of 100 years. Same thing in Russia. What Gorbachev is saying in Russia. Today we now, whatever the criticism was from outside, is being verified. Okay, what happened under Stalin, even Lenin for that matter. Quran wants to avoid that. वो कहता है कि गोल्स पहले क्लियर कर लो. अब सवाल ये है कि आपने वहाँ पहुँचना कैसे है. वो कहता है you must do that slowly, through education, through certain bylaws, by gradual changes in the existing law. Like if it is Arabia that time, or if it is today Pakistan, see what the situation is. Study the reality.
So the Quran
study the
itself
same.
will have to be changed.
No.
Because the
No,
Quran is-
आप सुनिए ना क्या? You have to study the reality around you.
Maybe that is
ठीक है ना?
that's
अच्छा.
one. I mean, there's no
हाँ,
disagreement
आप सवाल ही
on
बोल-
that. You
हाँ.
have to study the
Study-
reality
हाँ.
for any
And
situation.
then you know that you are moving there. So Quran has given certain guidelines for that transitory period. Masalan, आप slavery का देखें. I'll give you an example of what happened 100 years ago in America. When Abraham Lincoln, वहाँ जो slavery का जो pressure था, one of the worst kinds in the modern period.
Hey, can we
हाँ,
actually just
हाँ.
instead of this,
नहीं,
get
नहीं.
to the actual?
नहीं वो होता है. वो पता क्या है? You know what happened if you read that part of history
Yeah.
and literature? वो ये होता है कि उन्होंने
No, even if
वो
it's
law pass कर
evolutionary,
दिया.
it's 1400 years old
हाँ,
now.
नहीं, आप
It
देखिए
has
ना.
not evolved at all.
नहीं वो तो
Islam.
वो तो फिर एक
But-
अगला स्टेज आ गया.
नहीं, मतलब Islam has not evolved in 1400 years.
नहीं वो
It has been, and if the Quran is revealed and that it is for all times, etc., there is no, and if it is going to be that book that it will, even when you make these transitions and evolutions, etc.,
they were never made. They were never made. The whole thing ended.
There is too much
It
in the
just ended.
Quran that is complete. I mean,
हाँ.
one can quote sentence
No,
after
ये मैं
sentence. There's
बताती हूँ ना.
inequality in
नहीं
the
मैं
Quran.
बताती हूँ ना. देखो ना.
Now, how does this evolve
No.
without changing the
See,
Quran itself?
No.
You have to change the
हाँ,
Quran.
मैं बताती हूँ कहाँ आप करेंगे. अब देखो ना. अब हुआ क्या कि the moment the law of emancipation was passed, no provisions were made for the transitory period in America. If you read the literature of the time, there was so much of suffering, psychological, emotional. A person who has been bought and sold, suddenly he has to make decisions. He has to take care of himself. बड़े problems हुए. Many of them said कि हम नहीं जाएंगे यहाँ से. We just stay on here wherever we are. And that whole issue is there to be studied. Maybe even more research could be done. कुरान ने ये कहा है कि एकदम उनको emancipation तो हो गई. Now what you have to do is slowly and gradually, you have to adjust them to that situation of freedom. पहले तो ये कि encourage करो. All right, something happened. This happened. Free this one. So and so happened. Freedom दो. इसको भी freedom दो. And then treat them in such a way कि वो उनकी ज़िंदगी जो है वो unbalanced ना हो जाए. If they gain confidence, वो आगे चले. अगर वो आपके पास रहना चाहते हैं, keep him as a member of the family. वो सारे जो directions है ना of emancipating, finding every excuse to emancipate, to adopt them, to keep them in their homes, help them, ये सारे rules जो है ना वो उसके मुताबिक है. Now naturally they only apply if there is slavery. आज अगर पाकिस्तान में slavery है,
Let's move into something else.
नहीं
The
हो
law of
गया.
inheritance.
No, you said ना, you said slavery.
नहीं.
उसका ये है कि वो आहिस्ता गोल तो वही है ना, इक्वालिटी एसेट्रा. यहाँ वो सिर्फ मेथड्स हैं कि अगर स्लेवरी है तो आप इस अंदाज के साथ वहाँ पहुँचे. Don't create psychological. नहीं, अब अगर स्लेवरी नहीं है तो then that thing is gone. It lapses.
No, but the point
वो
is
तो
that
lapse
there
हो
are
गया ना.
other things. मतलब अगर slavery नहीं है आज,
हाँ.
it is certainly not because the Quran has said things.
नहीं वो तो कुरान नहीं वो तो
historically.
हाँ.
It is not because the Islam came in that slavery was eliminated. Slavery was eliminated from the world because of a whole range of other progressive movements and by the West and by philosophy, in fact. and Western philosophy that it became an immoral thing to own people. Not because the Quran said it was, and the Quran had anything, or that Muslims had anything to do with eliminating slavery.
They didn't.
They would have continued having slaves.
वो तो खत्म हो गई बात. वहीं
बात खत्म किसी और ने की.
हाँ.
उन लोगों ने तो
That's exactly
नहीं
की ना, लेकिन point वही आ गया ना कि अगर तुमने reject कर दिया कुरान which these people did, तो कर दो reject, मूवमेंट तो आगे चलेगी, कोई और कर लेगा. मैं बता रही हूँ ना, I wanted to give you that. ये तो slavery के आपने बहुत emphasize किया ना, तो मैंने ये कहा कि जितने भी वो bylaws हैं, जितने भी वो आगे आ गया ना, जितने भी bylaws हैं उसके अंदर, वो उसका जो objective है वो ये है कि do not create any emotional, psychological or economic problems for them, है ना, ये avoid करना है. And one generation gone, one generation gone slowly वो खत्म हो जाएगी. वो तो challenge करता है कि कुरान का जो method है, it economizes your effort. जो कुरान ने कहा वो तो फिर 500 साल के बाद achieve हुआ ना, after a long period of struggle. जिसने भी किया, वो बहुत लंबा हो गया. अगर आप कुरान को इस तरह फॉलो करते तो एक जनरेशन में सारी स्लेवरी खत्म हो जाती. वो तो उन्होंने फॉलो नहीं किया ना, कि you have to go stage by. अच्छा, हाँ, वो मैं कह रही थी कि ये तो इस किस्म के डिस्कशन को तो कई दिन चाहिए. अब इनहेरिटेंस का भी आपने ये कहा, उसमें भी इस किस्म के हैं. अल्टीमेटली पता है इनहेरिटेंस का क्या है? जो इकोनॉमिक्स की मैं जो बात कर रही थी ना, कि एवरीवन शुड हैव हिज बेसिक नीड्स, तो इसके लिए तो बहुत ही बड़ी रिसोर्सेज की जरूरत है. तो कुरान का पता है चैलेंज किया, जब हम इकोनॉमिक्स पर आएंगे, ये इकोनॉमिक्स पर आके कुरान को रिजेक्ट किया जाता है, बिकॉज नोबडी इज रेडी टू डू दैट. वो ये है कि जितनी भी लैंड रिसोर्सेज हैं, ये लैंड जो है, कुरान उसको कहता है कि ये उसी किस्म की फ्री गिफ्ट है जिस तरह एयर एंड सनशाइन. सो नोबडी हैज द राइट ऑफ ओनरशिप over the land in that particular economic system.
Nevertheless, if there is, a woman will get less.
नहीं, देखिए ना, अब वो क्या है कि वो नहीं होगी. अब पॉइंट ये है कि जब आप इस स्टेज पर खड़े हैं, जब बड़ी-बड़ी एस्टेट्स हैं, ठीक है ना, you get that. उसमें अब उसमें I tell you,
woman will get less. That is in the Quran.
अब वो ये है ना कि उसकी वजह बताइए. मैं वजह बता रही ना, everything has a reason. And there is something else besides that also. वो ये है कि ये जो है inheritance इस तरह करो, वो जो था ना law of primogeniture in Europe, कि eldest child को, ये बड़ी नेपोलियन ने इसको चेंज किया और अमेरिका ने भी चेंज किया कि आप अगर सब में डिवाइड करते हैं वो फ्रैगमेंटेशन हो जाएगी उसकी. फ्रैगमेंट होते 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 ये तो है ना असूल इनहेरिटेंस का जनरली, वो मर्ज हो जाएगा इनटू नॉन ओनरशिप. वो ज़मीन की ओनरशिप भी खत्म हो जाएगी. इन 2 जनरेशन भी फिनिश्ड. अब औरत का जो मसला है ना, वो इस तरह है कि कुरान डज एम्फसाइज दिस, कि ये जो है मेंटेनेंस ऑफ द फैमिली जो है एज अ मैटर ऑफ ड्यूटी, यानी कि लॉ कैन एनफोर्स दिस ड्यूटी ऑन अ मैन कि तुमने फैमिली को सपोर्ट करना है. यू सी, औरत को ये ड्यूटी नहीं है. आप अर्न करें, जो मर्जी करें, ये आपकी विल है, लेकिन आपको ये फोर्स नहीं कर सकता है कि तुम जाके नौकरी करो और बच्चों को पालो.
No, but it's
that you
very
can't
patriarchal.
That you can't do.
Very patriarchal.
हाँ, नहीं, वो ये है ना कि
that a man is ultimately responsible.
नहीं,
why should a man be?
नहीं, वो तो है, लेकिन
one might be more confident to do it.
हाँ, maybe वो कर भी सकते, वो कहते वो करे, लेकिन जिसको कहते हैं ना कि penalize कर सकना, वो सिर्फ आप आदमी को penalize कर सकते हैं. You can punish the man for not supporting. Women will not be punished. उसमें फिर वो ये चीज़ है ना कि no one can deny this factor, कि वो जो है बच्चे की जो मदरहुड की जो परवरिश है, woman has to play a very important role in that. ये तो फैक्टर है. उसकी जो प्रेगनेंसी है, उसकी जो इनएबिलिटी है, अब कितने राइट्स लेने पड़ते हैं. I'm not saying that she shouldn't work. She should work. उसमें तो जिक्र आता है कि औरत जो कमाएगी वो तो अगर वो चाहती मैं फैमिली को नहीं दूंगी, she needn't give, but the man has to give. That she will do, क्योंकि इस किस्म के वोकेशन में तो सेल्फ एक्सप्रेशन होता है. नहीं वो इनइक्वालिटी वो इस तरह है ना कि माँ तो माँ है ना. You can't deny that pregnant तो वही होती है. जब वो इनएबिलिटी होती है, इनएबिलिटी जो है या उसकी जो इनकैपेसिटेशन जो है ड्यूरिंग उसकी अपब्रिंगिंग जो है, अब यही तो बात है. Anyone can look after and create psychosis.
No, that is
नहीं
not a
वो तो
women
उसके लिए
can
आपको
say
बहुत
like-
कुछ करना पड़ेगा ना, फिर कुछ टाइम तो आपको देना पड़ेगा. आप 3 months maternity leave देती हैं, उसके बाद चाइल्ड केयर सेंटर्स होते हैं. You have to admit this everywhere. This has to be
No,
done.
this is true, but what one is getting back to again and again, you are saying very categorically that the Quran says that a man is duty bound to look after the family, which to my mind is an extremely patriarchal thing because it makes the man the head of the family and the one responsible
Not
for.
necessarily.
No, those who are responsible
नहीं, वो
economically
पता-
for
वो-
have decision making.
हाँ,
I mean,
पता-
this is
नहीं, हाँ.
as a historian you should know
हाँ,
this,
हाँ,
as sociological thing you should know this, that those who do have this duty, as you're calling it, then will control. The fertility of a woman is controlled in Islam. Islam does not control male fertility. Meaning that the progeny of a child must be identified as that man's progeny, and therefore she is controlled within marriage and confined to the marriage. She is
नहीं,
the property.
not necessarily. ये तो कहीं
नहीं,
भी नहीं
but-
कहा गया.
And,
ये only the man wanted to.
and on inheritance, definitely, even if you're
उसमें
saying that
inheritance
those
का पता क्या है?
generations में
वो तो
come
खत्म
back,
करेगा.
the point is
ना
men will always
ना
be,
ना
they're getting double the
now I
amount.
tell you, उसमें ये है कि ये सिर्फ सेकेंडरी चीज है. पहली पता क्या है कि anybody who is leaving this property behind must make a will. असल में will है, और उस will में बड़ी चीजें फर्क हो जाती है. मिसाल के तौर पर if the woman
But this
needs,
inheritance is very clearly put in
नहीं
the
वो तो
Quran.
है, लेकिन मैंने
It's
पता
nice,
नहीं
nice,
कहा कि
nice, nice.
will करें, पहले will करें. अगर will हो गई तो will अमल में आएगा. और inheritance का जो law ना हो, then this comes into
Which is an
action.
unequal thing
हाँ,
in the Quran
हाँ,
for all
तो वो
time.
ये कहा ना कि वो जो आदमी करेगा, he is responsible for maintenance. She is not. She will keep that as her own personal belonging. She needn't spend.
Even if she doesn't spend. I mean, most women and most people in this world don't have anything to even give, so it's an irrelevant question to a large extent.
नहीं,
Those who
वो
have,
ये होता है ना कि we are imagining things, as things are today. लेकिन जो सारा फैमिली का कॉन्सेप्ट,
there's
the
no
ideal thing जो सामने आएगी, वो बिल्कुल इतना फर्क है कि so difficult to visualize. ऐसे patriarchal का तो सवाल ही पैदा नहीं होता, क्योंकि उसमें इकोनॉमिक्स जो है ना, इस वक्त हमें यूँ लगता है कि वो डोमिनेंट होगा, लेकिन जब वो सिचुएशन अल्टीमेटली वहाँ पहुँचेगी, वहाँ nobody is economically dominant over anybody else, whether it's a husband or wife or whether it is
वो खेती
वो
है,
तो है ही नहीं.
हमारी खेती
अच्छा
है,
अच्छा, I'll give you my
But
booklet.
non-this is definitely there.
मैं आपको
You
दूंगी
can
वो.
capture women, you can have
No,
slave
no,
women,
no,
you
no,
can
no,
keep women,
no.
you can have 4 wives.
Not at all.
You can have 4 wives.
वो मैं आपको वो दूंगी क्योंकि ये बहुत लंबा डिस्कशन होगा. I brought my booklet because of this. इसमें मैंने डिटेल में ये डिस्कस किया हुआ है. You can do that.
So, but you feel that within Islam and how you see it, that as a woman, etc., what does it give you? It gives you a reason for existence. It gives you an explanation of life. It gives you an idealism.
अच्छा,
It
when
gives
we
you a
come to
future. See, what is your own personal thing,
personally
other
feel-
than what the raised name said?
I personally feel कि जो मुझे मिला है ना,
What does he do?
basically,
What does God do
हाँ,
for
मुझे
you?
जो बेसिकली चीज़ मिली है वो ये है कि the object पहले तो ये देखना है कि आफ्टर ऑल इंसान की ज़िंदगी का मकसद क्या है. जो कुरान ने एक्सप्लेन किया है, एज आई अंडरस्टैंड, वो ये है कि एक तो आपकी फिजिकल बॉडी है ना, वो तो जाहिर है फूड से, रेस्ट से, एक्टिविटी से वो सर्वाइव करती है, लेकिन उसके अंदर ही इज़ नॉट अ मेयर एक्सटेंशन ऑफ द एनिमल, जो व्हाट यू कॉल स्पिरिचुअल है ना. ये चीज़ वो जो आप स्पिरिचुअल कहते हैं, वो उसका लफ्ज़ जो इस्तेमाल करता है वो सेल्फ है. It doesn't use the word रूह, यानी रूह का लफ्ज़ या स्पिरिट का लफ्ज़ मिसलीडिंग हो जाता है. It uses the word of self. ये जो philosophers ने इस्तेमाल किया है, because that's the best translation of the word नफ्स जो कुरान में आता है. अब वो जो नफ्स है ना, ये है वो असली चीज़ जहाँ इंसान, जहाँ पे at least I felt attracted to, which gives a meaning to life. कि वो जो सेल्फ है, it's not something vague, spiritual या रूह जैसे लोग कहा जाते हैं जो कि मर्ज हो जाएगा यूनिवर्सल सोल में, ऐसी कोई चीज़ नहीं है. ये सेल्फ एक लेटेंट फॉर्म में, एक डोमेंट फॉर्म में, डोमेंट एंड लेटेंट All of us are born with it. Now, the awakening of that self and then the development of that self is the goal of life. अब सवाल ये पैदा होता है कि वो develop कैसे होता है. That's a very important point because everyone will say we need spiritual salvation, spiritual development. But the point is how. कुरान का challenge ये है कि you have to struggle constantly. It's a constant struggle, constant tension. जैसे एक बार उसको high level पर कहते हैं, not tension what we understand, but at a very high level, a constant tension and struggle to achieve that idealism which is embodied in the permanent values. Like I want all human beings to be equal. Yeah, I want all lingual and racial and color barriers to go. I want untouchability to go. I pick up all these permanent values as my goal. मैं कहती हूँ कि even to pick up one of them, is not easy. अगर आप, even if we take the women's issue, or let's say the slavery issue, or untouchability, or castes and classes, to struggle and get nearer and nearer. The nearer you get, the more you struggle for it. Yourself, the nafs, is slightly elevated. It is integrated. I mean, that self gets integrated, and so on. Every action, every thought that moves in harmony with the permanent value, it integrates, develops in a very positive way yourself. Of course, there is no perfection as such, but the more you are in harmony, the more you develop yourself in harmony with those values, you are a solid personality as you grow up. Now these permanent values are never man-made, because man's laws and values have to be relative. I mean, human thought, no matter what it is, it may be moving towards it, but they're relative. ये जो permanence का जो है, it can only come from supra-rational source. That is where Allah comes in. That is why they say the story doesn't begin from Allah, it begins from man, his nafs, the development of the nafs, in accordance with the permanent values, and the permanent values, their source is Allah. So from man, you lead on to Allah. This is how it argues. So if you want to integrate, now I know that if I'm doing this is my purpose of life. I have to fight for women's rights. I have to fight for human equality. I must fight for the abolition of untouchability, apartheid, poverty. I must fight against any ownership of any kind. Things have to be used, not to be owned, not to be possessed. So when I'm moving slowly, even if I make a little dent into the establishment, just a little dent, moving towards any one or many permanent values, there's a certain sense of achievement and integration that you feel. I won't use the word salvation or satisfaction because it leads to elsewhere. I mean, many things can satisfy us, one which doesn't satisfy another. But this is a very solid thing. I have done this for poverty, I've done this for equality, I've done this for the economic system or the political system. I've fought against a dictator. I've fought against a monarchy. I'm working for a system where discussion and arguments take place, where we can agree and disagree. I'm fighting for that system. Now these are very concrete images, and the more we fight for all of them, the closer we go, the integration takes place. And I feel that I'm doing something, I'm feeling that there is some meaning to it.
So in a sense it gives you an explanation for your own being, plus something to work for,
and idealism, because
a new world.
When we say somebody is very materialistic, it's partly this, that they act as mere extensions of animals and they have no idealism to inspire them to move into the future tomorrow. Like when we study about various personalities in history, we discover that we talk about these things, that this man had idealism, like Abraham Lincoln had, or maybe George Washington had. But then there are others who had no idealism, no vision. For me, the permanent values are a vision towards which I must move. And I think they are so beautiful in the sense that I must do everything to fight, if I see it in the present context, untouchability, apartheid, poverty, women. I mean, these are the things I can see. Or whether there's a dictator in my country or any other country, then you go beyond your frontiers. I mean, it has to be a universal movement. It's not only just Pakistan. You know, so when I'm moving in that direction, that vision beckons me. And I think without that idealism, I think I couldn't live. There has to be a vision, whatever that vision may be. But I think it's very important. Very important.
Thank you very, very much for spending this time with us.